One of the most interesting things that I've seen come out in media in the past few months is that regulatory controls is not just about the security of data, but also the sovereignty of data. And I think we've seen that in a number of instances, particularly around Meta, where there was no data compromise, yet there was a huge fine levied just through the fact that data was moved from one sovereign location to a non-sovereign location in a way where they didn't have control of the data.
Yeah, I mean that was a great example because there was no firewall breach, there was no insider that let someone in through their passwords, there was no traditional monitoring tool or analytics that would have picked it up, but they breached a regulation, as you say, about moving data from one geography to another in a way that no traditional network security could have prevented. However, if they put policy around it, if they put data protection methods around it, we could have prevented that and helped them avoid the resulting fine, which was the largest single fine that the European Union has ever levied against any company in the world.
Yeah, I think it's probably one of the first times that we've seen the regulators actually bare their teeth and enforce quite a significant fine in terms of monetary value and obviously putting that into the public domain as well, which damaged the reputation of Meta.
But I think also that changes the focus that people should have around network security. For 20 plus years, we've looked at physical intervention, we've looked at firewalls, we've focused on connections and putting more firewall rules in place and complicating that perimeter, which you still absolutely need. But people have forgotten the fact that people aren't trying to steal your firewall, they're trying to steal the data that's behind it. So you should focus on protecting your data as well, and so that wherever that data travels, it's protected. So when it goes outside of your perimeter, outside of your control, you're still protected and the regulators are still happy that you protected that data.
I think one of the really interesting points you made there is just using the term perimeter. And we're still in a world today where people are trying to define a perimeter because they want to be able to control where their data goes. Now, unfortunately, in a zero trust world, we're in a world where we don't always know where our data is, or we don't have physical control around our data. So trying to build a perimeter, whether it's a perimeter using firewalls, or whether it's a physical perimeter, such as a building around sensitive data that we own, is just not something we can achieve. So, the way we think about the perimeter, I think is really interesting in that if we can build a perimeter or sovereignty around the sensitive data itself, then really it doesn't matter where that data then goes, because you've protected the data, or the data owner has protected that data using a policy they've defined, using a key that only they have access to. So actually then location actually becomes irrelevant. And I think that's a really interesting way to think about sovereignty, because for me, sovereignty has been a huge challenge globally, for many organisations, because ultimately the regulators are putting real controls on them to say, this data cannot leave this sovereign region, but without giving them the tools to really deliver against that. And I think the way Certes thinks about sovereignty and around applying sovereignty to the data itself rather than a location will really enable customers to start meeting the requirements of their regulations.
Yeah, I think businesses need to realise that you can't fix a data problem with an infrastructure solution.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you're no longer in control of all of that infrastructure.
So in terms of the customers that we're talking to, Dan, is that something that we're seeing across the customer base, that there's a recognition there?
Yeah, I think there's a huge amount of focus now on wanting to understand how to protect the data itself. I think organisations are beginning to realise that the castle approach of building ever higher walls to try and keep the bad guys out is just not working. We tried that approach, we've tried the identity-based approach, but yet we still understand and see that the majority of attacks are perpetrated by trusted users that have gained legitimate access into the infrastructure. So it goes back to Simon's point that we need to provide that wrap, that encapsulation around the sensitive data itself.
Yeah, I mean, I was in a meeting a number of weeks ago, and one of the comments that was made to me around data was, once it leaves the LAN environment and it goes across the WAN providers, environment, that the data's going into the Wild West. And it sort of made me laugh a little bit, because that really is how people are looking at this, in terms of, once that data traverses the WAN edge and hits a service provider environment, it's really down to trusting that service provider to handle your data according to the regulations that you as the data owner have to adhere to. And I think that in itself, the fact that what you're doing is you're actually putting your trust in your service or services providers to handle your data as it needs to be handled. And I'm not sure that that's always something that's a good approach, because when it comes to regulations, the data owner is the person that is going to be fined when something goes awry with that data.
And there's a split between, as you said, the data owner is responsible for that data for its entire life, no matter where it goes. And you can't absolve that responsibility by handing it over to a service provider, because they're focused on uptime, they're focused on the consistency of the network links, not the data that's flowing through it. So their monitoring tools, their SOCs, their SIEMs, etc., are all there to look at what has happened. And when they've identified what has just happened, yes, they can go and protect it from happening again, but from a data owner's perspective, it's too late. They've already had the breach, they've already broken the regulation, they're always subject to fines. So from the data owner's perspective, all of the monitoring and controls and the AI that we're talking about putting into identifying threat analysis and seeing what has happened is too late. So the focus needs to change back to, how do I protect that data so that when the very first attempt at it happens, it's still protected. And that's a different approach and a different thought process that businesses have now got to change from just, it's network security, we've got monitoring tools.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to not just the mindset for the customer or the data owner, but also the mindset for the MSPs. Because when you look at what is the business model of an MSP or an MSSP, it's to deliver a number of value-added services across a multitude of customers. Now, when you consider that the more and more customers through regulation are having to meet the needs of certain regulatory control, then it means that service providers are delivering more services across regulated customers. And when you start looking at how regulation is changing, the onus is not just on the data owner to protect the data. The onus now falls on the service provider to provide the necessary controls so that when the data's in their control, the data is protected. But you don't, as a service provider, you don't always know how data needs to be protected. Is it sensitive or not? So ultimately you have to protect everything, and that can be a costly exercise. So now we've got MSPs who are taking on a whole load of risk, and it's risk that they haven't really applied into their economic models when they start building pricing for services. So, some MSPs are now looking at it that they're underwater in terms of, they may be building top line growth, but the risk they're also carrying outweighs the revenues that they're actually building. So what we need to do is to put service providers, MSPs, in the position where they can still deliver these services, but in a way where the data ownership and control of that data sits firmly with the data owner. And our ability to have that separation of duties where we can be delivered as part of a managed service, but where the data owner retains ownership and control of that sensitive data itself, I think is really the only real way for MSPs to truly de-risk themselves in this environment where regulation is just getting bigger and bigger teeth, as you say, Dan.
Yeah, I think MSPs are stuck between a rock and a hard place, because their customers are pushing them to provide innovation and help them on their journey to digital transformation, etc., while reducing costs. So the technologies that we're seeing, like SD-WAN and etc., really are helping that journey to digital transformation and driving down costs. But ultimately, they're bringing in a huge amount of risk from that data sovereignty and protection perspective. And Certes really helps MSPs mitigate that by giving that ownership and that control back to the customers, while still enabling them to move on that digital transformation journey and reduce their costs.